All right. Let's go ahead and turn our Bibles to the book of Esther. Esther chapter 2. We continue with our chapter by chapter study through the book of Esther. And so Esther chapter 2. Now, in Esther chapter 1, we have to remember the events that actually took place. And we have to remember, of course, that the king went ahead, of course, and called Vashti to the feast to show her off, basically as a sex object unto all his leaders and his captains and every other man that was there. Thousands of people, up to 15,000 people. And of course, she went ahead and did not go. And so that was very humiliating to the king. So he got very upset, and the wise men went ahead and suggested that he go ahead and put her away. And so, of course, he did. And they thought, of course, that if he did not act upon that, then, of course, that the woman throughout the kingdom, through the whole 127 provinces that the king was over, that they would go ahead and rebel. Of course, that would not happen, and they thought that it would, but they just wanted to have the woman, under authority in that. And so man has always promoted himself above women, and so we've seen that and we've covered that. But remember, that's what actually took place in chapter 1. And so he did send letters, and verse 22 of chapter 1 says, "For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people." So let's go ahead and pray, shall we? Gracious Father, by the blood of Jesus, we come to your throne, and we do ask, Lord, that you would continue to bless this time. We ask for wisdom and understanding as we continue to go through your word, through your infallible and inerrant word, Lord, through the Old Testament. Lord, open up our hearts, our minds, and our understanding as we continue to dive in the book of Esther. Lord, speak to us. We are here, Father, to know you. We are here to be conformed into the image of Christ, and we are here, Father, to love you, to grow spiritually. And so once again, bless this time, we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. So now as you read here in Esther chapter 1, verse 22, and then all of a sudden you start reading in chapter 2, verse 1, which says, "After these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her." So, that actually took us just a few seconds there. And quite often people make the mistake of not paying attention to basically the timeline. So we read that and we automatically think that it happened right away. But actually, it did not happen right away. 4 years are in between chapter 1 and chapter 2. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because of secular history. History shows us that after this event here in chapter 1, then Xerxes, the king, went ahead and began to conquer or try to conquer Greece. Remember that in our last study, we mentioned that a little bit, where this guy was very zealous and wanted just a bunch of power. So now after chapter 1, he wanted to get the power, and he started to go and conquer Greece. Remember that one of the reasons that we saw through Herodotus, the secular historian that speaks a lot about this king here, was that the reason that he made these feasts, or all these feasts, three feasts mentioned here in chapter 1, was because he was actually planning out the conquering of the whole world. So he was power hungry. He wanted to go out and conquer the entire world. And, we've seen rulers that have wanted to do that. Alexander the Great was another person that wanted to do that. There's been a bunch of other rulers that wanted to do that. So this guy was just one of those rulers that wanted just a bunch of power. And so he, chapter 1 ends, of course, and he takes off with his army, with his, many soldiers, over 1 million in that. Excuse me. And so he begins to, or he tries to conquer Greece, and he's trying to take over the world. One thing we don't see too much of here in the book of Esther is his personality. We do see here in the book of Esther, a sweeter side, you can say, of his personality. But when you study secular history, you just see a lot more things that are not mentioned here in the book of Esther. And so with this king here, of course, secular history presents Ahasuerus or Xerxes here as a very prideful, a very arrogant, a very furious, intensely furious, a very wicked and a very power-hungry individual. That's one thing that the book of Esther does not really bring out. We do see a little bit of his wicked side and his unjust side because of what he does to Queen Vashti. I mean, that was totally unfair, of course. And that, of course, was done because of the way they would treat women back then. And but we also see that in the amount of women that he had. So, but Herodotus does present Ahasuerus once again as a very prideful, very arrogant, very furious, very wicked, power-hungry individual, and also a little bit on the nutty side. And that because of what he would do and what he would command his soldiers to do. When crossing the Hellespont River, he actually had his men whip the river because he just didn't like what the river had done. And how the river had actually helped some of his enemies in that. I mean, come on, who in the right mind would go ahead and begin, whipping the river a certain amount of times and pronouncing curses upon the river? So he had his men whip the river, and they actually said this, and we get this from secular history: "You bitter water, thy Lord lays on thee this punishment because thou hast wronged him without a cause, having suffered no evil at his hands. Verily, King Xerxes will cross thee, whether thou wilt or not. Well, dost thou deserve that no man should honor thee with sacrifice? For thou art of a truth a treacherous and unsavory river." And that's what he had his men do, and he thought that by doing that, that would actually help him out. Secular history and through Herodotus also tells us that he was having a lot of nightmares. And that prior to going to battle, prior to trying to take over Greece, he was having a lot of nightmares, and people, of course, were trying to interpret those dreams, and some people were trying to change the way that he was going to do things. So, also, he was a very, very wicked guy because on his way to the conquering of Greece, a soldier by the name of Pythias the Lydian approached the king here, of course, and he has 5 sons, and of course, all 5 sons are going to battle, and as a father, of course, he's very concerned because he knows that a lot of men are going to lose their battle, and as a father, he thinks that all his sons are going to be killed. So, as a father, he goes to the king and makes a request. And this is what secular history tells us, that, Pythias the Lydian, one of his soldiers, told him. It says, quote, "O my lord, thy servant has 5 sons, and it chances that all are called upon to join thee in this march against Greece. I beseech thee, have compassion upon my years, and let one of my sons, the eldest, remain behind to be my prop and stay and the guardian of my wealth. Take with thee the other 4. And when thou hast done all that is in thy heart, mayest thou come back and save thee." But Xerxes was greatly angered and replied to him, "You wretched, darest thou speak to me of thy son, when I am myself on the march against Greece with sons and brothers and kinsfolk and friends? Thou who art my bondslave and are in duty bound to follow me with all thy household, not excepting thy wife, for thyself and 4 of thy 5 sons, the entertainment which I had of thee shall gain protection. But as for him to whom thou clingest above the rest, the forfeit of his life shall be thy punishment." Having thus spoken, forthwith he commanded those to whom such tasks were assigned to seek out the eldest of the sons of Pythias, and having cut his body asunder, to place the 2 halves, one on the right, the other on the left of the great road, so that the army might march out between them. Then the king's orders were obeyed, and the army marched out between the two halves of the carcass. So, that's what happens. And of course, this father he's very concerned because his sons are going to be lost in battle. And actually, he lost a lot of men. He lost a lot of men. And unfortunately for him, he takes off to the conquering of Greece and power hungry, but he loses. A lot of his navy is destroyed. A lot of his soldiers are killed. And he comes back in complete humiliation. And so, so he comes back. And that's actually what happens between chapters 1 and chapters 2. Now, you can, of course, read Herodotus, the secular historian, once again. And there's just a lot more, of course, that this guy did that actually gives you a little bit more of an understanding of his personality. And so, of course, once again, that's not what Esther brings out. The book of Esther doesn't bring out, and of course, it wasn't intended to. But when you study secular history along with a lot of these kings and a lot of these stories, you just get to know a lot more stuff. So, but that's the personality. So, yeah, even though we might see a very romantic story, very loving story, made for a movie, and of course, there's a movie out there by the name of Esther. And, even though we see him as being such a very loving guy, history does show us another side of him. So, even though he was the king, he was still, he was not perfect. He was far from it. So once again, here in Esther chapter 2, we see that after these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So, he's now remembering. He's there in the kingdom and, he doesn't have a wife. And so now this kind of tells us that he was kind of repenting of what he had done. And he, of course, realized that he had treated Vashti very unjustly, as women would be treated back then. But, of course, the word of the king, the decree of the king would actually not be changed. So he would not even be able to bring Vashti, the queen, back, because once the king made a proclamation, it was turned into law, then that law could not be changed, not even by him. And we're going to see that later on also in the book of Esther, where wicked Haman, of course, decrees the killing of all the Jews. And so it's given into law, but that decree cannot be turned. And that's why the king Ahasuerus does, of course, fulfill Esther's request in that the Jews can go ahead and protect themselves, and they do. But that happens because the king's orders and the king's decrees cannot be changed. And so that's why he's not able to bring Vashti back. So you could say he's totally bummed out, not only because of Vashti, but also because he lost the battle, and so he's very bummed out. And so now in verse 2 it says, "Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the woman, unto the custody of Higi the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so." Now, of course, his advisors, these same council, of course, that had counseled him to treat Vashti in such a way, they're, of course, are the ones that now are asking the king to do this. They're suggesting the king to do this. Of course, they're not going to advise to bring Vashti back because it would not be in their benefit. Why? Because, if the queen was to be brought back into power, then, of course, many of their heads would have flown, in revenge. And so they're not going to do that. And so now, of course, they're asking the king to do that. And they ask the king to do that because they know that he's going to fall into their suggestion, into their counsel, because they know that the king was very sensual. They know that this king loved women and had a bunch of women, had many concubines. Even though he had Vashti, he had a lot of concubines, and that was just a very common practice back then, where the king would go ahead and have many concubines. Even though it was a very common practice, and the king saw it as a very fair practice, it was not right still. It was still wicked in every way. And so, they know that he's very sensual, and so they advise him, of course, to choose many young virgins, many women that had not known man, of course, throughout his kingdom. And he can choose one to replace Vashti. And of course, that is a good sound to his ears. And so he commands, of course, the people. He commands his soldiers to go throughout the whole kingdom and get the best looking, the most prettiest women, the most prettiest young ladies, of course, that had not known man, that is, that had not laid with man, virgins, so that way they can bring him back to him. And of course, he can go ahead and choose out of all of them to replace Vashti. Now, it does seem, of course, that here in these verses from verse 2 to verse 4, it seems as, if they're going to have a beauty contest, and it seems as, young virgin girls are going to sign up and they're going to choose the prettiest one out of a certain region and that. But actually, the common practice was kings would actually order their soldiers, and they would go and they would take the young women. They would take the young women out of against their own will, and they would take them back to the kingdom. And that was a common practice, and most likely that's actually what happened. Some Bible commentators actually believe that they were having, a beauty contest. But, it's most likely that probably did not happen. It was most likely the way they would actually usually gather up the women, and that's by force. And so, they began to do that, and and it seems that, of course, out of all the thousands of women that were gathered, he was going to choose one, and the rest, what was going to happen to them? They were going to go back to their land or go back to their fathers. Well, no, that's not the case either. What would actually happen, yes, he is going to choose one, of course, we know to be Esther. But all the other women, after spending the night with them to see if he liked her to replace Vashti, then she, of course, would be his. And the moment that they were captured, they belonged to him. They were married to him already in a sense. But they were going to be used as concubines. So, he had basically a different young girl every single night. But the rest, of course, they were not going to be let go. They were going to be kept there as his harem. And, they were going to be his concubines in that. Now, the only way that, one of those young girls would actually see the king again after spending the night with him would be if he remembered her. If he remembered her by name. If there was something so special about their evening together, their night together, that if he remembered her, that's the only way that girl would be brought back. But just imagine, having a very sensual king, having a different woman, a different girl every single night, just many different women throughout the whole year in that. It would be very difficult for him to remember that. But now that's where we begin to see God's providence here. That's where we begin to see how God begins to work with Esther, in the life of Esther in that. Because yes, there's a bunch of women, one every single night. But then Esther comes about. And all of a sudden, he just so madly falls in love with her. And so that's where we begin to see God's hand at work. Yes, we don't see the name of God here, but we do see his hand working here. And he is orchestrating everything. Even out of the most wicked things, God still can bring out some good. And even, how he treated Vashti so unjustly, so unfair, God still does good through that. And even though we see, that he was a very wicked guy, God is still going to even use him through Esther to save the Jewish people. So that is actually, what we start to see here in the book of Esther. And God's in control of everything. Everything that's happening here, with Esther being taken, that's not by pure chance. That's not by, as some would say, that she was lucky because now she gets to be with the king. No, luck has nothing to do with it. It's all God's providence, his hand at work. He begins to orchestrate his will even out of the most wicked things. He's not the author of the sin, of course, but he uses that and he begins even to work out of that. And we always have to remember that even when things might get difficult for us, even though we might see some most horrible things that man does, because man will be the author of those horrible things, God will still begin to work out of those things. And so we always have to remember that. As Daniel 4:35 says, he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? So nobody can go ahead and say, well, what have you done? And he does what he wants. And he works with the easy and the most difficult things, with the nice and the most wicked things. We always have to remember that. So once again, we begin to see the providence of God coming about here in the life of Esther. So in verse 5, now it says this, now in Shushan the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither a father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So we begin to get introduced now to another important character here in the book of Esther. And of course, it's Mordecai. And so, that's Esther's cousin in that. So Mordecai does play a very important role in the book of Esther, because even though that he was not perfect and far from it, as was Esther, and we'll see that in a little bit, God is still going to use them. But this guy, Mordecai, was from the family of Kish. Remember, of course, and Kish actually was the father of Saul of Tarsus, not Saul of Tarsus, Saul, the first king of Israel. And so he was a descendant, of Kish, and so he was related to Saul. And we don't know why Mordecai remained, and Esther remained in the land. Remember that the king actually had allowed the Jewish people, he gave them the opportunity to go back into the land. And remember that Zerubbabel actually took 50,000 Jews that first trip from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And then also remember that there was a second trip that was done with about 2,000 Jews. And then there was another trip. And of course, that one was led by Ezra. And then another trip, Nehemiah, the last book that we studied. We don't know why he remained in the land. But you know what? It could be that God just put it in his heart to stay in the land because of the plans that he had for him and for Esther. And so then in verse 7 and 8, it tells us, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. So they gather up all these women, and of course Esther is among them, and they're gonna go ahead and prepare them for the king, and they have to go through a long purification process in order to be with the king, as if he was a god. But that was a common practice back then as well. And so not just anybody would be with the king, but all the king's women would actually go through this long purification process and, through beauty processes, basically, So, and then verse 9 tells us, and the maiden pleased him, that is Esther. So now she begins to gain favor, with the king's servants. And so, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So as she goes there, she's taking there, and now the king's servants begin to see her. Now they're not only just seeing her beauty, but of course she is very, very lovely, very beauty, but they start to see something more in her. And they just start to fall in love with her. They start to favor her, that is. And they just start to choose her. They give her all of a sudden women servants, ladies that are going to go ahead and just serve her. And then she starts to go through the purification. And of course, the servants give her just so many things and just favor her. And they're preparing her for the king. And so that's what is going on here. Now in verse 10, of course, you see that Esther had not showed to the people that she was a Jew. And so she kept that in silence. And so she did not want anyone to know that she was a Jew. Why? Because, of course, Mordecai had actually told her not to tell anyone, to keep her Jewishness secret. And so she is not going to tell anyone, and she doesn't until the certain time, of course. One of the key elements that we see in this chapter here is Esther needing to keep her Jewishness a secret, and that, of course, until the time appointed. Nobody could know until a certain time that she was a Jew. Why? Because, of course, they would go ahead and take her out, because that portion was not going to be given over unto a Jew. And so the Jewish women were not going to be allowed to inherit a kingdom, as Esther is going to inherit. So Mordecai, of course, he sees the opportunity and he plans it out. And most likely he is hoping with all his heart and perhaps praying unto the Lord that she be chosen. But of course, she is not going to tell anyone that she is a Jewish person. Now, Jewish people were actually known by the way they dressed. And they were known also by their diet. They couldn't eat a certain amount of things. And they actually were known by not working on a Saturday. I mean, if you see a Jewish person today, you can tell that he's a Jew. Or actually most Jewish people. You can tell that they're Jewish people, and they're all over New York as well, And I saw a Jewish family down in Brownsville not too long ago, and I wanted to go up there and give them a hug, but they're not too common here, but you do see Jewish people, and you recognize that they're Jewish people. So even back then, you can recognize that they were Jewish people by their diet, once again, by the way they dressed, and then also by not working on the Saturday, but also by not marrying a Gentile. So you see, now this brings up a little problem here in the book of Esther. The problem is that we start to see that Mordecai, the cousin, and Esther, they were not perfect. They were not perfect because they're keeping their Jewishness a secret now. And so now, in a sense, they're participating also with the way the Persians lived. Because had she, not participated in certain things, then they actually would find out that she was a Jewish, and then she would be kicked out. And so Bible commentators actually, point this out. And they also point out the fact that that Esther, by marrying this king, she's breaking the law of God. Because remember that as we've gone through the Bible, you do see that A Jewish person was not allowed to marry a Gentile. But now Esther is in a position where she is going to marry a Gentile. She is there, and her Jewishness is a secret, and she is going to marry a Gentile. And so she is breaking the commandment that was given by Moses. And so this is where we begin to see that they were not perfect. They were not, you can say, in full fellowship with the Lord, as Ezra was. Remember that Ezra, or was it Nehemiah, one of those, of course, rebuked the people that had gone back to Jerusalem, because remember that he actually took off, Nehemiah. He went back to the king after 12 years to report, went back to Jerusalem. He was probably away for about 2 years. And remember that short amount of time, they had actually married. They had mixed marriages. They started to marry pagan people, Gentiles. And so remember that he rebuked them. And so, they were not allowed. And so now we see Esther, of course, she's not perfect. But you know what? God uses imperfect people. One of the things that we usually think when we read scripture, or, when we think about an Old Testament saint, a New Testament saint, is that they were so perfect that they walked on clouds. But that is so far from the truth. They were not perfect. They were just believers in the Lord, and of course they tried to live as righteously as they could, but they were not perfect. I mean, we've studied the life of David, we've studied the life of not Jeremiah, Elijah, this great prophet. Remember that he had not a lapse of faith, you can say, but he was so furious and just wanted to die and went to the desert. That's when, the Lord told him, "What are you doing here, Elijah? I've been so zealous for the Lord, now they're wanting to kill me." And so, very frustrated, very angry. So they were not perfect. Neither was Esther and Mordecai. And that gives us hope. Because, hey, we're not perfect, and I'm not perfect, and I'm far from perfect. And you know what? Hey, God chooses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, as 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says. He can use a fool like me. He can use anybody in anything. Sometimes we begin to think that, hey, well, God uses the most intelligent and the most perfect people. But that is so far from the truth, because the Bible tells you something else. God uses our imperfectness. God uses us being imperfect so that way He can be glorified and exalted. So we always have to remember that. So don't ever think that God cannot use you. God can use you in any situation, and He can use you in a mighty way if you submit to Him, of course. But we don't have to be perfect. That gives us hope, and that gives me hope. And so then, of course, she's keeping her Jewishness a secret. Verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the woman's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So he loved her, of course. That was like now his own daughter. And so he was worried and just wanted to get updates on how she is doing. Then verse 12. And when every maid's turn was come to go in to the king Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the woman, for so were the days of their purification accomplished. That is 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. So they had to go through a whole year of purification. I mean, they had it made. They had it, what would be every woman's dream, I would say, but also a nightmare, because, they had it all. I mean, they had all those baths with all those perfumes and all the facial treatments. Just imagine, women love that stuff, don't they? Facial treatments, massages, and they buy so many bottles with different smells, from different plants and that, and, they put it on them, and their face, they put so many type of creams on their face, one after the other, and so these women actually had it all. That's something I could never actually understand, and how one cream goes one after the other, and then they wash themselves, and then something else, and then another thing, and that's women, and women actually love that, and so this was a woman's dream. It could also be a nightmare because, of course, the women, once they had been with the king, they could no longer marry, and once again, they could not go to the king again by themselves. And the only way they would be with the king would be if he actually called them by name. But just imagine, once again, having all these women throughout the whole year and all throughout the various years, it would be so difficult to pinpoint one woman. And so they would live most likely in, just with the women by themselves, all in, in loneliness and that. And not living with their parents anymore. So apart from having it all, it was also a lonely life. And so it was a woman's dream in a sense there. So now verse 12 once again, and when every maid's turn was come to go into the king Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, that is 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then verse 13. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. So anything that they thought that actually would make them more beautiful, and other things that would actually help them. Hey, they only had one shot to convince the king that they were the chosen one. They only had one shot there to be with the king, to show the king, of course, that they needed to be the new queen. And so, just imagine you could say the competition among women. And women, when they're at it against each other, they're very competitive, as men are too, right? But just imagine, you only have one shot out of hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of women, and very competitive in that. So, that's what was going on. Then in verse 14, in the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. So, that's what I was mentioning earlier in that. Now, verse 15. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Notice in verse 7 that it says about Esther, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful. So Esther was very fair, very lovely, very beautiful. Not only, externally, but in her personality. She was a very loving person in the way she conducted herself, in the way she spoke to people, in the way she acted. She was very fair and very lovely, and that just brought out the best in Esther. So she did not need, everything else. Oh, I think I need this blue dress, or I think I need this white dress. How do I look in this high heels? Not that they wore high heels back then, but how do I look in this? How's my hair and this and that? She didn't need all that. She was very beautiful, and she knew that she was going to go in unto the king, and if God wanted her to be in there, then of course she was going to be there. She did not need to worry about anything else, no extras in that, no extra whistles. But she was very fair, very beautiful, loving personality, as she is presented in the book of Esther. So she obtained favor in the eyes of everyone that saw her. I've met and I've seen such beautiful women. I mean, beautiful women that, out of 1 to 10, you would consider them a 13. Beautiful women, but such an ugly, ugly person. I mean, I've seen some most beautiful women just opening their mouth and just a bunch of trash and garbage comes out. And that, you know what, it's like, yeah, she might be beautiful from the outside, but she's a very ugly person from the inside. But that was not Esther. She was not focused on her outward appearance as much. She was not focused on what people saw. And unfortunately, a lot of women, as a lot of men, but it's Esther right now, so we're just going to pick on women. A lot of women, their focus is just too much on the outside. And there's something wrong with that. Because you can be so lovely from the outside. You can have beautiful blonde hair. You can be a tall blonde, blue eyes, everything perfect. But yet, you can be so ugly. And that right there, it's worth nothing in the eyes of God. I think that women, yes, it's okay if they go ahead and, put on their makeup and that. Pastor Chuck actually used to say that if the house needs painting, paint it. And women can actually go ahead, they can go ahead and put makeup on that. That's fine. But I do have a problem with, man, just constantly focused on the outside and putting so much makeup that you just look so awful. In trying to look so beautiful, it just makes you look so awful. I've ran into, women that it's like they grab a lipstick and, it's just way too much, and all for the focus of external beauty. But the most important thing is not the external beauty. The most important thing is the inside. In the eyes of the Lord, you can have the most ugliest person, the most ugliest woman, but have such a beautiful heart. God will honor that most ugliest woman than the most prettiest woman with such an ugly spirit. That's funny, of course, but it's true, actually. I think that we live in a society, we live in a time, in a place where it's just too much on the external. And that's so wrong. It just shows how ungodly this world is. You turn on the TV, it's all about fashion. Commercials, it's all about fashion. It's all about external beauty, external glory, how to look your best, even when you're asleep. It's sometimes, man, I really don't care how my hair looks. I don't, I do grab it in the morning. I grab the brush and I will comb it, but once in a while, I'm like, forget that, I'll just put on some gel real quickly so it won't be flying in the wind, Put on some gel and just leave it like that. And it looks so sloppy and messy. And then my wife, of course, tells me, Greg, you didn't comb your hair? I don't care. I'm not going to comb my hair. I'm not out there to please anyone. And then, of course, I jokingly tell her I look my best when I don't care how I look. I tell her that, but I don't mean it, of course. But it's the most important thing is the inside. And that's what the Bible says. And with Christian women, it's okay. Yes, go ahead and brush your hair. And please brush your hair. No, I'm just kidding. No, go ahead and brush your hair. Yes, if you need to put makeup on, yeah, it's fine, put makeup. But let not your emphasis be on the external. Let it be inside. Because that's what the Bible says. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 to verse 6, we did see that in our last study, of course, but it's not about subjection, being under the authority of your husband. Now it's about the beauty. It says here in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 through verse 6, likewise, you wives, be in subjections to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may be without the word, be won by the conversation of the wives. That is, by the manner of living, by the way you live. And then it says, while they behold your chaste manner of living coupled with fear, whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold or of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, for which is in the sight of God of great price. That's much more important. Being a lovely, godly woman inside. Because yeah, you can deck yourself out so much, but if you're an ugly person inside, that beauty actually turns into ugliness. But you see, Esther was not too focused on that. She was very lovely and very beautiful. And yes, she did enjoy all that because she had to go through that. But her person was just very beautiful. And there's some sweet, sweet people. I'm sure you know some. They might be beautiful or they might be ugly people. But when you talk to them, even though they might be ugly people, man, they just bring out such a beauty out of them because they are just so loving, so sweet. They're filled with God's love. And man, I enjoy being around those people. But I don't enjoy being around someone that is so beautiful, but yet so ugly inside. So let's not focus on the outward, ladies. Well, yes, you can, of course, but the most important thing, let it be the inside. That's the most important thing, what Peter tells us here. And so then, of course, in verse 15 and on, it tells us this. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. They were actually these young virgins, of course, and then the king's women, his harem. They were protected by eunuchs, and so of course the kings would go ahead and make eunuchs out of men because they would not have the problem of having the men touching the women. So they would go ahead and castrate the men, and so they would be eunuchs. Then in verse 16, once again, so Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So he falls in love with her. Perhaps every other woman is just trying so hard to convince the king that they're the chosen one, that they need to be queen. But no. God already has a plan and a purpose in the life of Esther. And so God's hand, God's will is going to be fulfilled. And so it doesn't matter if there were 1,000 women, 2,000 women there that the king, went through. God was still going to use Esther to fulfill his plan and the purpose. Then in verse 18, it tells us this. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. So he was very excited. He was a very festive type of a king, and he made a bunch of feasts, and so he gave gifts to people. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Now we see, of course, here that Mordecai now is not a regular person. Now actually he's starting to come out as someone important. Because now, of course, Esther uses her authority and her power now as queen to get her cousin Mordecai, of course, into power. And so God's even going to use that. So Then in verse 20, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king was known to Mordecai, and the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So what happens, of course, is, God even allows Mordecai to be in that right place at the right time. Because had Mordecai not been placed in that position by Esther, or of course by the Lord, then of course these two guys would have succeeded. They would have succeeded and they would have killed off the king. Then of course the Jewish people would have been in trouble. So now, boy, I was really planning on going into chapter 3. Boy, I don't want to rush through chapter 3. Boy, I don't know what to do. You know what? Let's go ahead and we'll end here. And we'll leave chapter 3 for next week. I don't want to rush it. There's just a lot of good points and important points that we need to see. And but something out of chapter 3, and we'll end with this, okay? We see, of course, God's hand at work now, because he's beginning to he puts Esther at the right place at the right time for such a time as this. Then, of course, he puts Mordecai in the right place as well. And, of course, he hears this plot and he saves the king's life. He doesn't get rewarded for it. He will get rewarded later for it, of course, according to God's timing. But one thing that I see out of chapter 3, and then actually also what's coming out of chapter 2, is that, God will protect his people. God will protect his people. And no matter how rebellious they have been. You guys watch the speech of Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday. If not, it's on Fox News. You need to watch it, because that has a lot to do with this story here. And he actually speaks about Esther. So you need to watch it. As Christians, you need to be on top of those things. The Prime Minister for Israel, you need to know what's going on. Because the things that are going on right now, with the Obama administration, and making this nuclear deal with Iran. And Iran, of course, is one of the major powers in the end of times in the 7 years of history, of world history, that has a major role, of course, in biblical prophecy. And so we see what Iran wants to do. Iran, as Benjamin Netanyahu was saying yesterday, if they get their hands on nuclear weapons, immediately they're going to want to annihilate the Jews. The same thing that this guy, Wicked Haman, wants to do. And so that's, of course, what the Obama administration is doing. And so just an awesome, awesome speech that you need to listen to. If you know your Bible and if you know Bible prophecy, you need to listen to that, because we are living in the end of days, folks. Whether you want to believe it or not, that doesn't matter. We see the key players in biblical prophecy coming about. We see, of course, China. We see Iran coming about. We see Turkey. We see Syria. And they're going to want to attack Israel. And of course, Ezekiel 37, 38, and 39. You need to know those chapters. In the end of days, of course, these nations are going to want to infiltrate. They're going to want to attack Israel, but God's going to intervene. And we know that even though Iran gets nuclear weapons, they're not going to annihilate Israel. But they're trying to do that. And Netanyahu was saying, of course, that Iran it's exactly like ISIS. They're just fighting to see who controls the Muslim nations, and then the world. So Iran is exactly like ISIS, the very same thing. They support a lot of terrorists, throughout 5 countries in that. So just interesting. And so Esther has a lot to do with what's going on today. So I leave you that homework, okay? Next week, this week, before next Wednesday, please listen to Netanyahu's speech. You need to listen to it. As a Christian, you need to be concerned. You need to be aware of that. Okay? And so you need to listen to it, and next week I'm going to quiz you on that. So let's go ahead and pray.